The live broadcast lasted less than 3 minutes, but what was said in those 3 minutes was enough to haunt the internet forever. At first, nothing seemed out of the normal. The camera was stable. The lighting was flat and unremarkable. A familiar face appeared on the screen, one that millions had seen before in concerts, interviews, and carefully scripted performances. This was supposed to be routine, another ordinary broadcast in a world saturated with them. Then he looked directly at the camera. There was no smile, there was no casual greeting. His eyes fixed on the lens with an uncomfortably intimate intensity, as if he were no longer speaking to an audience, but to someone in particular. Someone invisible, someone watching from behind the screen. His voice dropped. He told a viewer to break a tooth, to send it to him. He said he would keep it. He said he would place it alongside his puppy's first baby tooth. For a brief second, silence followed. That kind of silence that does not belong in a live broadcast, the kind of silence that indicates a boundary has just been crossed. Almost immediately, his expression changed. Panic flooded his face as if the words had escaped his mouth against his will. He began to hit himself again and again with a broken voice, while he cried, saying that he deserved to die. He wondered how he could have said something like that. He was not begging for forgiveness, but for punishment. Those watching did not know what to do. Some laughed nervously, others remained paralyzed. Many replayed the video again and again, looking for context, irony, a performance, but nothing about it felt prepared. There was fear, raw and uncontrolled. For those who had followed Menglong closely, the scene was disturbingly familiar. Before his death, Menglong had shown signs that something was not right. Not openly, not in ways that could be easily explained or proven. His changes were subtle. A pause that was too long, a gaze that lingered where it should not, a tension beneath seemingly normal words. After his death, people began to look back. Old videos resurfaced. A painting that he had shared once attracted special attention. He had asked the viewers to guess what it represented. Later, he revealed that it was a portrait of his 2 dogs. However, longtime followers noticed something disturbing. The style looked nothing like his previous works. The lines were harder. The space felt closed and hidden within the composition, faint but deliberate, appeared the number 11. In China, 1 in 10 is not just a number, it is a plea for help. Other details emerged, audios that resonated as if they had been recorded in a concrete room, walls in photographs that looked like underground spaces rather than a home. In his final live broadcast, his hand briefly formed a gesture that some viewers recognized too late. A distress signal, a silent SOS. At that moment, no one connected the dots. No one stopped the broadcast. No one asked for help because no one knew that they were being asked. And this was not the first sign that Menglong was trying to ask for help. When people say that there were no warnings, what they usually mean is that the warnings did not take the form they expected. They imagine a confession, a desperate call, a public collapse. What they overlook are the silent deviations, the small fractures in the routine that only become visible in retrospect. Menglong did not announce that he was in danger. He did not accuse anyone by name. Instead, his anguish emerged in fragments through decisions that seemed slightly out of place, through messages that did not demand attention, but interpretation. One of the first clues was dismissed as harmless creativity. In an old video, Menglong sat quietly in front of the camera, holding a painting that he had just finished. He smiled and asked his viewers to guess what it was. The tone was light, almost playful. When no one answered correctly, he revealed the subject himself. It was a portrait of his 2 dogs. On the surface, there was nothing alarming about it, but longtime followers noticed something immediately. This was not how Menglong painted before. Years ago, his drawings of the same dogs were loose and expressive. The lines were soft, the backgrounds open, The animals seemed relaxed, almost joyful. In this painting, everything felt different. The strokes were sharp, the proportions distorted. The space around the dogs seemed compressed, as if the air itself had been pushed inward. Even more disturbing was a detail that most viewers missed upon the first viewing. Hidden among the layers of paint, almost merged with the texture, were 3 numbers: 110. For some, it seemed like a coincidence. For others, it seemed intentional. In China, 110 is the police emergency telephone line. It is not a number that one embeds casually in a work of art. It is a number associated with urgency, with danger, with the last option available when everything else has failed. At that moment, no one pressed him about it. Then there was the sound. Several of Yu Menglong's later videos presented an audio quality that felt incorrect. His voice echoed slightly, as if the walls around him were bare and hard. It did not sound like a bedroom or a living room. It sounded like a confined, concrete, underground space, a place where sound had nowhere to escape. When he was questioned in the comments, he downplayed it. Bad equipment, bad acoustics, nothing to worry about. People accepted the explanation because it was easier than considering the alternative. Photographs began to circulate after his death. In one image, Yu Menglong appeared standing in front of a gray wall with a neutral expression and a rigid posture. At that time, it was published without context. Later, some noticed that the wall matched those found in the lower levels of certain artistic spaces he had visited. Windowless, industrial, cold. The possibility was disturbing. If he was not at home, then where was he? The most chilling evidence emerged from his final live broadcast. It was brief, fragmented, at times almost devoid of meaning. He spoke of the weather, of the dark sky, of remembering to bring an umbrella. Then, without any transition, he said that he was learning magic. He said that death could be an art. Most viewers heard ramblings, a stream of consciousness, nothing more. But after his death, people replayed the video with different ears. Someone transcribed the sentences. Someone else noticed a pattern. Taking the first character of every sentence, a hidden message appeared. Today, they want me to die. It was not a metaphor. It was not a poetic exaggeration. It was a statement. At another moment in that same broadcast, Yu Menglong raised his hand. The gesture lasted less than a second. His fingers moved in a way that seemed accidental. However, for those who know distress signals, it was unmistakable, a silent call for help. Some even claimed that under the audio distortion, his voice descended to a whisper, a plea so soft that it was almost devoured by the static. Save me, help me. When these interpretations began to gain strength, it was already too late. There was no emergency response. There was no wellness check. There was no intervention. The signs were scattered too thinly, buried under the noise of everyday content. They required patience, attention, and the willingness to believe that someone could be asking for help without saying it directly. This is the uncomfortable truth of many unsolved deaths. The signs are rarely absent. They are simply misinterpreted. Yu Menglong did not disappear without a trace. He left behind a sequence of subtle but coherent clues which pointed to fear, to confinement, and to urgency. Each one on its own could be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern difficult to ignore, a number hidden in a painting, an echo where there should be warmth, a poem disguised as casual speech, a hand signal hidden in plain sight. All of it suggests a man who believed he was being watched, a man who believed he had limited time, a man who chose to communicate in ways that could evade the restrictions under which he found himself. The tragedy is not just that he died. The tragedy is that the message reached his audience only after the sender was no longer there. By the time the meaning was understood, Yu Menglong had already died. After Yu Menglong's death, the attention did not fade. It shifted. The public focus moved away from the man who could no longer speak and turned toward those who still could. Those who had shared rooms with him, those who had attended the same dinners, those whose names appeared again and again in fragments of memory and rumor. There were 17 people present the night that Menglong died. At first, this data circulated in silence, almost cautiously. No official list was published, no confirmations were made. The number emerged through overlapping accounts, leaked schedules, and conversations that were later deleted. What followed was not an investigation in the legal sense, but something much more volatile, a collective scrutiny driven by suspicion, grief, and unresolved fear. Some of the people mentioned were artists, singers, actors, public figures whose careers depended on visibility and favor. In a matter of weeks, their appearances began to be questioned. The comment sections filled with accusations. Event organizers faced pressure. Online petitions demanded cancellations, boycotts, and the revocation of permits to perform. For the first time, silence became a burden. A young singer, previously promoted as gentle and inspiring, appeared on the stage with an altered appearance. His posture was rigid, his face sunken. Viewers described him as exhausted, even frightened. Snippets of his performances spread with texts questioning if he was under stress or under threat. Formal complaints were filed. Rumors of a violent past, previously buried, resurfaced and multiplied. None of the accusations were proven, nor were they clearly denied. Others opted for withdrawal. Social media accounts went silent. Posts were deleted. Public schedules changed discreetly. Trips abroad were presented first as work, then as rest, and then ceased to be explained. Those who remained visible spoke only in vague generalities, offering condolences without substance and reflections without detail. They spoke with care, as if every word had a weight beyond its meaning. The most disturbing reactions did not come from statements, but from behavior. One figure, previously known for his emotional stability, began to show erratic behaviors during live broadcasts. A seemingly innocent question about a local snack triggered an explosive reaction. The phrase itself meant nothing. Missing teeth, a regional term, an innocent misunderstanding. However, his reaction was immediate and extreme. He lashed out verbally with an anger disproportionate to the question. Only later did he apologize, explaining that he had misunderstood the comment. The explanation convinced few. Why would such a trivial phrase provoke so much fear? The answer that many arrived at was not guilt, but memory. The idea began to circulate that those who were present on the night of Menglong's death shared a knowledge that they could not reveal, not because they were responsible, but because revealing that knowledge had consequences. In this interpretation, the collapses, the withdrawals, and the self-destructive behaviors were not performances. They were responses to stress. People under pressure do not always flee. Sometimes they crumble in public. Alongside the social impact arose a different narrative, one that did not depend on proofs or testimonies. It depended on belief. Spiritual channels began to publish readings. Tarot cards were drawn. The interpretations varied in details, but converged in tone. Collapse, loss, fear, karma. Several readings described individuals harassed by anxiety, seeking protection through rituals, offerings, and isolation. External appearances of luxury and travel were described as illusions hiding an internal decomposition. For skeptics, this was an exploitation of tragedy. For others, it was an attempt to articulate that which could not be said openly. In cultures shaped by restriction, meaning often migrates. When the truth cannot be expressed directly, it finds other forms, in symbols, in superstition, in ritual. The idea of a karmic consequence gained strength not because it was mystical, but because it offered structure. They suggested that even if justice did not arrive through institutions, it might arrive through time, through attrition, through the slow disintegration of safety and certainty. One by one, those connected with Yu Menglong seemed to lose something: reputation, stability, freedom of movement. The losses were unequal, unpredictable, and never officially linked. However, the pattern proved difficult to ignore. The question changed. It was no longer about who caused his death, it was about who was afraid to talk about it. Fear, after all, does not require guilt. It requires exposure. It requires proximity to something dangerous enough that survival depends on discretion. In such circumstances, silence becomes strategy. Darkness becomes armor. From the outside, the silence seemed suspicious. From the inside, it might have felt necessary. No confessions emerged. No revelations followed. What remained was an atmosphere of caution, of people watching what they said, how they moved, and where they appeared. In this environment, innocence and silence became indistinguishable, because sometimes silence is not innocence, it is survival. As the noise surrounding Yu Menglong's death became louder, something else became increasingly clear. The system was not designed to answer the questions that were being raised. There would be no transparent investigation. There would be no public reconstruction of the facts. There would be no official narrative capable of absorbing the contradictions that had already surfaced. Instead, the story expanded outward, moved beyond the individual, beyond the room, beyond the 17 people whose names circulated in fragments. What emerged was a broader pattern, one that had appeared many times before in cases that were never completely closed. People who spoke too frankly disappeared from public view. Accounts were suspended without explanation. Interviews were cancelled at the last minute. Individuals who had once hinted at irregularities suddenly withdrew their statements, replacing them with silence or carefully worded denials. In some cases, even those denials disappeared. The message was subtle but unmistakable. There were limits to how far curiosity could go. In this environment, fear did not need to impose itself loudly. It was ambient. It remained in the pauses between sentences, in the way conversations ended abruptly when certain names were mentioned. It lived in the decisions people made without announcing them. To stop asking, to stop sharing, to stop noticing. The absence of information began to function as information in itself. When legal processes fail to materialize, people look for meaning elsewhere, not because they abandon reason, but because reason requires data. And the data was being withheld. What remained were impressions, correlations, and the uncomfortable feeling that something significant had been deliberately hidden. This is where narratives of fate and inevitability take hold, not as superstition, but as frameworks for understanding power without accountability. Karma, in this context, was not a mystical punishment, it was erosion. The slow accumulation of consequences that could not be erased, only delayed. Careers stalled without explanation. Opportunities dissolved in silence. People who previously moved with freedom began to behave as if they were being watched. Even those far from the center of the case adjusted their conduct, lowering their profile, moderating their speech, choosing safety over clarity. No official order was necessary. Control, once internalized, no longer needs to be imposed. The death of Yu Menglong did not produce a confession, but it produced a chilling effect. It demonstrated the cost of being too visible while being vulnerable, of emitting distress signals without having an institution willing to respond. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not the lack of answers, but the consistency of the evasion. Every path toward a resolution seemed to collapse into the same conclusion, that some truths exist in spaces where verification is impossible, not because they are false, but because they are untouchable. However, the truth does not depend on recognition to exist. It persists in patterns, in behavior, in what people refuse to say, in the way a community reorganizes itself around an absence. Yu Menglong's final months now seem less like a descent into confusion and more like a corridor that was narrowing. Fewer options, fewer safe exits, communication reduced to symbols, gestures, and fragments disguised as art. Not because he wanted to be cryptic, but because clarity was no longer viable. In that sense, his messages were never intended to provoke an immediate rescue. They were contingency plans, records, proofs that he had understood his situation, even if others had not. This reframes the entire question. The problem is no longer whether anyone heard him in time. The problem is whether anyone was allowed to respond. In systems where intervention is restricted, survival usually depends on invisibility. Speaking becomes a risk. Listening becomes a responsibility, and those who notice too much quickly learn to forget. The absence of a formal conclusion does not mean that the story ends. It means it continues in another form, in rumor, in memory, in the silent adjustments people make to avoid becoming the next unsolved name. The death of Menglong occupies that space. Unsolved, not discarded, suspended. A reminder that there are cases where the truth is neither hidden nor revealed, but left intact, preserved by fear rather than by silence. The question is no longer who killed him. The question is who is still listening. In the months following Menglong's death, no new facts emerged, no documents were published, no timelines were clarified. The public space, previously restless with speculation, slowly adapted to the absence of an answer. This adaptation was not acceptance, it was fatigue. People returned to their routines. New scandals replaced the old ones. The algorithms moved on. However, beneath the surface, the case never completely disappeared. It remained suspended in fragments, reappearing every time someone reviewed an old clip, a screenshot, or a line of speech that felt out of place. What turned out to be most disturbing was not what was missing, but what had been left behind. Menglong's final communications now read less as expressions of instability and more as deliberate acts of preservation. Each message was conditioned, shaped by the awareness that direct language was no longer safe. The choice to speak in symbols, to hide meaning in art and gesture, suggests a man who understood the limits of visibility. He did not accuse, he did not expose, he documented. This distinction matters. Documentation does not demand immediate belief, it requires time. It depends on the possibility that someone will one day observe with enough attention to notice the pattern. In that sense, his actions resemble those of people operating under surveillance, where survival does not depend on speaking out loud, but on leaving traces that cannot be easily erased. The tragedy is that these traces were only recognized after the threat had already passed the point of no return. There is a tendency when facing unsolved deaths to look for villains, names, faces, clear lines of causality. However, some cases completely resist that structure. They exist in systems where responsibility is diffused, where pressure is applied indirectly, and where outcomes are determined as much by the environment as by the individuals. In such systems, accountability becomes abstract. The story of Menglong does not end with an arrest nor with a verdict. It ends with a realization that vulnerability, when combined with visibility, can become lethal in spaces that do not offer protection, that asking for help does not guarantee rescue if the response channels have been silently dismantled. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is not the death itself, but the recognition it imposes on those who observe it. The understanding that messages can be clear, sincere, and urgent and still not produce intervention. Not because they are ignored, but because acknowledging them implies risk. This shifts the burden. The question is no longer what Menglong should have done differently, it is what responsibility lies with those who witnessed the signs and chose or were forced to remain passive. His final months suggest a man who believed that even if he could not be saved, the record of his fear might endure. That the truth, fragmented and delayed, might eventually surface through accumulation and not by revelation. In that sense, His messages were not requests for compassion. They were accusations against a system in which silence is safer than response and ambiguity is preferable to clarity. Some messages are not meant to save the sender. They are meant to expose the world that ignored them.